Whoa, wait a second. You mean to tell me that the Apostle Paul got into a massive fight with Peter, James, and John over circumcision and preaching the gospel and the grace of God? So today's agenda is going to be a little bit weird. We're going to be kind of picking up where we left off yesterday. We were talking about the Apostle Paul yesterday. We were talking about the book of Romans, and we were talking about him preaching the gospel and preaching the gospel to the Gentiles and why he most likely said the phrase, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." So we're going to kind of pick up from there and move into the book of Galatians and Acts chapter 15. And we're going to be talking about the Jerusalem Council, if you will, which is this massive fist fight that takes place. It's not a fist fight, but it was like a fist fight with words. Talking about this massive fight that happened between the Apostle Paul and the apostles who were in Jerusalem. But before we get too far into this video, I just want to take a couple of seconds to tell you about my YouTube channel and why I think you should subscribe. First of all, this is a Bible study channel, and what we do here is study the Bible because we take the Bible seriously and we seriously study the Bible. So if you are looking for a Bible study that's online, that's absolutely free, you just found it, and you can go ahead and click subscribe. Oh, and I forgot to tell you, my name is Adam Jordan Clark, and I publish a brand new video every single day. So today we're going to be talking about the Apostle Paul and the other apostles, which would be Peter, James, and John. And we're going to be talking about them and this fight that happens. Now, this fight is actually in Scripture. It's in Galatians chapter 2, and it is in the book of Acts chapter 15. And it's important to understand this story because, first of all, Galatians is a letter written by Paul. So when we read Galatians chapter 2, you have to understand that we're reading this, when we read Galatians 2, we would be reading it from Paul's perspective. So it's his perspective of the story. And then when we go to when we go to Acts chapter 15, we're reading a totally different author. Paul didn't write that book. That's somebody else who wrote that book, probably Luke, whoever Luke was. So two different perspectives. And I'm sure, as you probably know, when somebody tells a story, then it happened to them, they're going to tell the story a little bit differently than what somebody else might tell the story who probably heard it secondhand. And so that's what we're going to see in these two accounts. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 15, and we're going to look at Galatians chapter 2, and we're going to read about this story of this fight that took place. Now, the fight that happened is over circumcision and grace and the Gentiles and the Jews. You've probably heard about this story before. Most people remember the story where where Paul stands up and he says, "I confronted Peter to his face because he was eating with the Gentiles, and then the Jews came." I'm sure you've heard that story before. Well, that's kind of like the tail end of the story. From Paul's perspective, that's not actually the real big issue that's going on here. The real big issue is circumcision and whether or not Gentiles have to be circumcised to come into the church. Because you have to understand the history that's happening here. The history at their time, that is. When God made his covenant with Abraham, he told Abraham about circumcision. And he basically said, look, you guys got to all your males have to be circumcised, because circumcision is a mark of God's people. And so everybody who came into Judaism from Abraham all the way up to the Apostle Paul, they all got circumcised. So if you were born into the family, you got circumcised. If you were adopted, you got circumcised. If you married into a family, in other words, you were a Gentile and then you married a Jew, you would get circumcised. That's how you became a part of the group. And so when the early church is dealing with this problem of circumcision and Paul's preaching the gospel, he's not preaching circumcision because he doesn't believe that they need to be circumcised, which of course you can see the problem because the Bible is very clear about this. You have to be circumcised if you're going to be part of God's people. Paul's saying, nope, that's not true. The apostles in Jerusalem are saying it is true. So they get into a big fight. Now the question is, how does this fight play out? Generally speaking, when people think about this problem, they come up here to Acts chapter 15. And, they deal with the Jerusalem Council. And so they point to this passage and they basically say, look, this is the fight that went down, and it got resolved. And the reason why they say that it got resolved is because they come down here and they read this story in Acts chapter 15, and they come to the conclusion that this problem was resolved. And so one of the places where we see that the problem was resolved is when James is speaking. So in verse 12, it says, the whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul, telling about signs and wonders God had been performing among them and among the Gentiles. And when they finished, James spoke up and he said, brothers, listen to me. Simon has come to describe to us how God first invented to choose his people from the Gentiles. And so he goes on to quote this passage and yada, yada, yada. And then he says, here's my judgment, that the Gentiles and the Jews can have some type of communion together. And then they come down here, and basically the idea is that James, who, by the way, is the leader of the church, not Peter, it's James. James is writing a letter to send back to Antioch with Barnabas and Paul. And so the idea that's happening here is that James writes a letter independently of Paul and Barnabas. So it'd be two separate testimonies. And what it would be showing the believers in Antioch is that Paul and Barnabas were accepted, and their message was accepted. And they have a special letter from James, who is agreeing that they have been accepted. So that's sort of the idea. Well, all historians know that when you come across these kinds of things, these kinds of stories, red flags start going off, and you're like, okay, well, wait a second. We got to investigate here because this sounds a little bit fishy. And I know that we have a little bit of problem when we start reading the Bible historically, because we're not supposed to say that something sounds fishy because nothing could ever be wrong. And so this, this part gets very complicated. So I'm going to try and not make it very complicated. And I'm going to do it by explaining this very simple point. You basically have a group of scholars who are saying that there was this big fight and it was never resolved. And Paul basically said, well, I don't care about you people. I'm going to keep preaching my message and my gospel. And he went off and did it. And the apostles said, well, we're going to preach our gospel. And so they split. Some scholars believe that. Other scholars say no, that they reconciled it. And really what you have to do is you have to read Acts chapter 15 for yourself, and you have to read Galatians chapter 2 for yourself, and you have to compare them in detail to really come to your own position. I've done this for a while. I actually spent about a couple of months doing this. And I actually came to the position where I don't see any discrepancies in my reading of the text. I don't see any problems like that. I do see that they got into a fight. That's number one. I understand what they were fighting over. But I think that there's evidence to suggest that they resolved the issue in some way. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't resolve it fully. They probably didn't resolve it fully. But they definitely came to a good resolution. Now, whether or not Acts 15 is that resolution, I don't know. I don't think I can say that. But I can say I think that they did come to an agreement of Paul preaching the gospel to the Gentiles and not requiring them to be circumcised. And I'll show you what I mean by that in Galatians chapter 2. This is sort of Paul's version of the story. It's the entire chapter, but I do like this part right here because what he does is very interesting. He says, then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem. And keep in mind, he's defending his gospel message. And what he's arguing here is what he started out arguing in the first chapter, which is that his gospel came by revelation from Jesus Christ. He didn't learn it from anybody or anything like that. And so he's defending it, and he's saying, look, after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas, and I took Titus along also, and he went in response to a revelation. And then he says, and then I was meeting with those who were esteemed as leaders, a.k.a. the apostles, and I presented to them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. And I wanted to be sure that I was not running my race in vain. In other words, I wanted to make sure that the gospel that I was preaching was the same gospel that they were preaching. And so he goes on to basically explain this whole point to us. And so from Paul's perspective, what he's saying is like, he's saying like, dude, my gospel that I've been preaching is the same gospel that the apostles are preaching in Jerusalem to the Jews. Okay, so Paul's preaching to the Gentiles, and the apostles, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and all those people, they're preaching to the Gentiles. Now, what's very interesting about this passage that you have to understand is that he makes this very interesting statement. He says, I went up in response to a revelation. And this is an important thing to understand because in Acts chapter 15, we get a little bit of a different story, actually. What Acts 15 tells us is that it was not because of a revelation. It's because he was required to go. And so that's a little bit of a difference. It seems to imply here in verse 2 that it was divinely orchestrated. So, I mean, this could be a semantical issue. It might not be. But another important point to mention here is that he says, meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders. He's talking about the Jews, the apostles in Jerusalem. And when you read Acts chapter 15, we do see this also. There is a private meeting that happens between Apostle Paul and the other apostles. And this is the first time that he's ever really met all these people too. And so we're given this idea that they compare their gospels. And so some scholars say after they compared their gospels, they found out they were totally different, and so they went their separate ways. Some people say that. I'll tell you this. I believe that Acts is a separate account, and I believe that Galatians is a separate account. And when I put these two accounts together, me personally, when I put them together and I read them in detail separately side by side, I don't see discrepancies. I don't see these kinds of problems at all. I could be wrong, but I don't see them. What I see is actually a very consistent story. I do agree that there was a fight. There was definitely a fight that happened. There was a long argument. This probably took out for a long time. There's some details that are all mixed up. For example, the revelation thing, or was he required to go? I mean, who knows? Who cares? I mean, stuff like that happens all the time. It's not really that big of a deal. But Paul's story is very, very clear. He's saying, look, I got my gospel from Jesus personally. He told me this gospel. I didn't learn it. I wasn't taught it. It came from Jesus. And he compares it with the apostles. And also it's important to note here that Paul's talking about this problem to the church in Galatia. The church is in Galatia. And Acts chapter 15 records pretty much the same event, which is this fight that happens. So we know that this fight was very, very, very big. And so you have to understand something. When Paul's defending his gospel, which we talked about in the last video, we said, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. We talked about that phrase. You have to understand something. When Paul is talking about the gospel, his gospel that he's preaching, which we see clearly laid out in the book of Galatians, when you read over Galatians, he'll defend his gospel. But you have to understand something about his gospel. His gospel is to Gentiles, and it's not requiring people to be circumcised. So you don't have to be circumcised to become a part of God's people. This has never happened in human history with God that we know of, because the law required that you had to be circumcised, and Paul's saying, no, you don't have to be circumcised. And so basically he elevated his gospel to the level of revelation, said, look, this came directly from God. And so that's absolutely amazing, because if Paul was right, the gospel that we're reading about really did come from God. My name's Adam Jordan Clark. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to comment below and tell me something interesting, or maybe a really cool story, because I like reading your stories and I like reading your comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification, because I publish a brand new video every single day. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and as always, I will see you in the next video.